So anyhow, how many of you folks have know about Celebrate Recovery? Cool, very good. Then I don't know. For some of you who don't understand what Celebrate Recovery is, when people hear the word recovery, they automatically go to drugs and alcohol. But for us in Celebrate Recovery, we call it any hurt, habit, or hang-up.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you know, the drugs or alcohol or pornography or, you know, gambling, what have you, that's just a symptom of something that's going on inside you. And so what Celebrate Recovery does is helps a person unfold that, unpackage that. Where did I get this thinking? Where did I get this from? And so we go through a 9 to 12 month 12-step program. Again, it's based on the Bible, and through that, it points that we need a Savior, that God loves us and forgives us, but He also makes us accountable. And so we do our what's called an inventory. And we list all the people who hurt us. We list all the people who we hurt. And then we make our amends. We talk to our sponsors, we talk to our accountability people, and through that process, people are set free. And you learn tools after that on how not to fall back into your old way of thinking. Most of us, like I said, somebody or something affected us, and so what I'm going to do is that after we've done our 12-step program, you know, part of your recovery is sharing your testimony. And again, it's, you know, one thing that I learned when I was in CR was, you know, once you confess it, it has no power over you. And so, again, we tell our stories to show what God can do through relationship with Him and through the Celebrate Recovery Ministry. And so I'm going to share you my testimony. I grew up in an abusive and dysfunctional family. I was the eldest of 4. My mother was born in Hawaii and came from a very traditional Filipino family. My father was a Native American Indian, a career Marine who fought in the Vietnam War. Being a child of a Marine was very different. We were taught to be little Marines. In public, we were taught to speak only when spoken to. People used to comment to my parents on how well we behaved, but the truth was we were too afraid of our father. Now, as a kid, I remember being proud of seeing my dad in his Marine Corps uniform and wanting to be like him one day. It was great having him home. I felt safe knowing he was there, but all too soon he would return back to the war, and I missed him terribly. But as the war continued, I remember my father coming back home a different person. My feelings of safety would change. It was then the anger, the abuse, and the alcoholism would show its face in our home. Now, my father had a very hard view of disciplining us and raising us kids. My father's view was that discipline was punishment, and it was meant to hurt, and it was to be given without mercy. Now, I don't know where my father got this view from, but I can only assume it was carried out in his own life. But I also believe he got much of his parenting skills through the Marine Corps. As you can imagine, this life was very tough. My father did not tolerate weakness. Now, when I was a child, I remember being afraid of the dark. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find myself in a dark room and would begin to cry. This would infuriate my father, and he would tell me to go to sleep. But as I continued to cry, he would run into my room, spank me, and throw me into a dark closet. There were many times I would call out to my brothers and sisters to let me out, but they were too afraid. I would eventually cry myself to sleep and be released the next morning. Besides the spankings, he would make us kneel on dried pinto beans on a hard linoleum floor. We were not supposed to cry because men don't cry. I learned that crying only made the punishment harder and longer for us. So I eventually learned to take the pain and didn't cry. I learned there was no tolerance for weakness, or mercy. As the eldest, it was instilled in me that I had to protect my family. There were many times that my father would get home drunk, get into fights at the club. He would later be dropped off at the home, and my mom was told to hide the car keys. But eventually my father would wake up and demand her to give the car keys back to him. When she refused, I could hear the sound of my father punching and slapping her. I would hear dishes crashing on the floor and my father yelling. I would gather my brothers and sisters into the room and tell them to be quiet. We were all so scared. Many times I wanted to call the police to rescue my mother, but at the same time, I didn't want them to take my dad away, and I felt confused and helpless. This type of abuse went on throughout my life. I never knew what to expect from my dad. Some days we lived in peace. He would take me to football practice, attend all my games, and play basketball or catch with me. Those were fun, but they were far and few. Most of the time we lived in fear because it was hard to know how to approach him, especially when he started drinking. When he started drinking, he would be the kind of dad every kid wanted. He was affectionate, bragged to his friends, and hold us. But as the drinking continued, he would become the angry, hurtful man. He would tell us how we never appreciated him, and that we couldn't do anything right. This quickly deflated us, and we learned to stay away from him. As teenagers, we learned to cope with this turmoil in different ways. My brother became an active gang member. My sister, who was molested by him, started smoking, using drugs, and moved out of our home before she was 18. My baby sister, she became obese, and I turned to sports. Sports saved me from the insanity and kept me away from the house. Now, as a young child growing up, I was not the very popular kid. I was the fat, dumpy one that always got picked last for teams. This rejection, coupled with my parents' lack of encouragement, caused me to have some self-esteem issues. But I continued to work out in high school and through adulthood. Soon my body began to change. People, especially women, began to notice me. This type of attention was new to me, and I didn't know how to handle it. It wasn't long until I became involved with other women, married or not. Now, I grew up Catholic, so I knew about what God's Word said about adultery, but I ignored it. I was getting what I wanted, and I didn't care. After all, God never helped me in the past. Now, it was at this time I started to work at the happiest place on earth, and came in contact with a certain secretary named Mary Ann. She worked at the office, and I would visit her frequently. She was married at the time, but I knew she wasn't happy. I began seeing her eventually moved in with her after her divorce. Now, Mary Ann had 2 kids at the time. She had Heather, who was a very energetic and challenging child. Some might even call her spoiled. The other child was Travis. Travis was born with several health defect problems, including cerebral palsy. Now, I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I told myself, just don't do what your father did, and you'll be okay. But I was naive and stupid to think I'd be any different. After all, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Now, at first I was tolerant of the children. Heather was a bright child, and I was slowly able to manage her. But when it came to Travis, all I felt was anger and frustration because I couldn't control him. I used to tell Mary Ann the reason why Travis acted the way he was because she babied him. If you treated him like a normal child, he'll respond like a normal child. But I was a fool and had no idea what I was talking about. With each passing day, Travis's problems began to anger and frustrate me. When I would tell him to do something and he wouldn't do it the way I wanted him to, I would fly off the handle. I would spank and yell at him and lock him in his room. I had become my dad. I was someone who didn't tolerate weakness and I found no mercy in my heart. Mary Ann did not approve of what I was doing, but I think she thought she could change me. So Mary Ann and I decided to have a child of our own. I think Mary Ann thought if I had a child of my own, this would soften my heart. But when we had Michael, the only thing it did was cause a great big gap between my son and her kids. This caused a great deal of pain to Mary Ann, who saw her children being subjected to such a cruel and angry man. Now during this time, I had become a police officer. And you would have thought that because I came from such an abusive family, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with violence. But violence breeds violence. I learned to accept it and even craved it. But I also wanted to make a difference in this world. I suppose it was because how I felt so helpless as a child. By becoming a cop, maybe now I would do something to right all the wrongs that had occurred in my life. Now I would be able to protect those who were unable to protect themselves. So my career started in Los Angeles in a place known as Watts. I learned that I had to be tough or tougher if I wanted to survive this jungle. So I quickly learned to speak their language, and again, that language was violence. This life of violence quickly fueled my anger in my heart, and yes, I did right many of the wrongs that took place in the ghetto, but it was not done in love or mercy. There was one incident where my training officer and I responded to a domestic violence call. When we got to the house, I could see the wife had been beaten. When I asked her what had happened, she refused to talk. And there in the same room was her husband. He was sitting there with that cocky, smug look on his face. And I immediately thought of my mother and the many times my father had beaten her, and him having that same look on his face. So let's just say I decided to right the wrong in that man. I took him into another room, and let's just say we came to an understanding. This was the life I began to live each and every day. My job and my co-workers were everything to me. After all, I depended on them to watch my back, and they in turn expected the same of me. Since I frequently brought this attitude home with me, it put a lot of stress on our already tense marriage. I was driving Mary Ann further and further away from me. She was looking for kindness, but I could not give it to her. One morning I caught my son in a lie, and I slapped him across the face, which left a mark on him, and it sent him to school. A few hours later, Child Protective Services was at my door and asked what had happened. I told him what I had done, and then went to work, and I told my sergeant about the incident. I was soon being questioned by our station's detectives, and I later learned that they filed criminal charges against me for child abuse. Now I had to face the hard facts of my actions. I was about to lose everything dear to me, my wife, my children, and my job, but I did not know what to do. Mary Ann had been attending Canyon Lake Community Church. She would invite me to go with her, but I thought it was a waste of time. After all, church was for the weak. When I would go, all I would do was make fun of our pastor and fidget around. But now I was in need of some serious help. I remember telling myself, you've tried everything your way and that hasn't worked out. Let's try it God's way. So one morning I woke up, remembering hearing a voice telling me to get up and go to church. So I told my wife, let's go to church the next day, and this floored her. After all, I'd be working the graveyard shift and only have a few hours of sleep. But she went along with it. The following day we got up and went to church, and our pastor was giving the message, and I could have sworn he was talking directly at me. Everything he said hit me between the eyes, and at the end of the message, he gave an altar call. I sat there in the pew telling myself, get up and go forward, but that would mean I was weak, and I didn't want to admit that. But I was tired of living the way I was, and I wanted to find peace in my life. I wanted my family back, so I stood up and began to take that long walk forward. When I got to the altar, I fell to my knees and prayed the sinner's prayer. When I did that, the weight of the world was lifted from my heart. When I turned around, both Marianne and Heather were crying. And this was the beginning of my new life. God immediately went to work our lives. Marianne rededicated her life. Heather accepted the Lord at a harvest crusade. We dedicated our children to the Lord, and life had changed. And I quickly became involved in church. I became an Awana leader, an usher, and a deacon. Now, you would have thought being so active in church, I wouldn't have time to do anything else, especially involving sin. But you would be wrong. In 1 Corinthians 10:12 it says, "So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall." Yes, the Lord did forgive me of all my sins, but it didn't take away the years of trash that I grew up with and all the walls I built around my injured heart. I had some very dark secrets that I never resolved or confessed to anyone. This insecurity began to emerge in my life again. Because I felt so ugly on the inside, I turned to pornography in order to escape my pain, and eventually became involved in an adulterous affair. Each time I would try and quit on my own, but I failed. I tried to justify my sin by telling myself, since God had forgiven me of all my sins, what was one more? But in Galatians 6:7 it says, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Marianne began to suspect something was going on. She noticed me distancing myself from church and church activities. She saw I had a poor attitude towards people and things. She would try to talk to me about it, but I would told her she was just imagining things. But deep down in my soul, a battle was taking place. I remember there were many times I was afraid to sleep. I felt if I died in my sleep, I would wake up in hell. Marianne eventually confronted me about the other person that I had been calling. Now I tell you, my first thoughts were to lie. But I was tired of living the way I was. I was tired of living this double life. Matthew 6:24 says, "No one can serve two masters, either he'll love one and hate the other." So I admitted it to her. I remember the look on her face, and it killed me. I hurt her like never before, but she eventually asked me if I loved the other person, and the truth was I didn't. I loved my wife, I loved my family, but most of all I loved the Lord, and I was tired of running from Him. So Marianne reached out to me and hugged me. We cried together and went home. It was then I knew that God had forgiven me, but I knew the real work was ahead of me now. I had hurt so many people by my actions, but what do? It was at this time Celebrate Recovery was brought to our church, and Marianne was already participating in it. Now she demanded that I attend with her if we're going to make this marriage work. So reluctantly, I agreed. Not that I didn't want our marriage to work, it's just I didn't want to have to talk to strangers about my sin or problems. After all, no one was going to be able to relate with my struggles, and everyone was going to think I was some kind of a freak. So I attended my first meeting, and I felt so uneasy because there were people who knew me. They knew me as a church leader, a dad, and a police officer. Now they were going to find out the real truth about me. I remember attending small group and hearing the leader introduce himself as a grateful believer in Jesus and revealed what he struggled with. This floored me because he was so honest about his struggle, but I was not ready to share. This went on for several meetings. But then the pastor confronted me and told me I needed to confess it. He said, if you confess it, it has no power over you. Hearing this statement gave me the courage to do so. With tears in my eyes, I began to confess my sins and struggles out loud. I saw some men wiping tears from their eyes. Others had great big smiles on their faces. I saw that even after confessing my sins, they still loved me. These ordinary men who God had gathered that night showed me something I'd never experienced from my Father. They showed me God's grace, they showed me His unconditional love, and they showed me His forgiveness. For the first time in my life, I felt God's loving forgiveness in my heart, and I was truly set free. I soon got involved in a men's 12-step study and began to learn so much about myself. I found freedom in knowing that I have a God who loves and forgives me of all my sins. God showed me why I did the things that I did, but He made me accountable for all my choices. I learned to forgive my parents and the others who had hurt me. I made my amends to my son Travis, to my wife, and to others I had hurt along the way. I learned the tools to keep me from relapse and changed the way on how I looked at myself. I no longer struggle with the sin of sexual sin. I am a child of God, and He says I'm good enough. I have been set free from my sexual sin for 10 years now. Celebrate Recovery has changed my life and saved my marriage. The cycle of violence has ended in my home, and my family is the closest we've ever been. My son Travis even calls me Dad. In the 12th step it says, having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. In 2008, our pastor who brought Celebrate Recovery to our church was released due to the struggling economy. So he told me it was time for me to step up and serve. Now in the past I would have said I wasn't good enough or qualified to lead. But God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called.
Amen.
Since that time, both Marianne and I serve as ministry leaders at Celebrate Recovery at Canyon Lake Community Church. And I get to serve as a state rep for Celebrate Recovery in the Inland Empire. In 2016, I retired as a deputy sheriff for Riverside. And my wife bought me a motorcycle.
Amen.
So,
Hallelujah.
we both get to serve with the Black Sheep Motorcycle Ministry together, doing the two favorite things we love, riding our motorcycle and serving God at the same time. It's been incredible. In Philippians 1:6 it says, God who began a good work in you, within you, will keep right on helping you grow in His grace until His task within is finally finished. I now know that the Lord never gave up on me. No, He did not approve of the path that I took, but He saved me from myself and kept me from falling into the punishment I deserved. I still struggle at times with my demons, but I have new tools and supportive people in place to help me from relapsing. If you are here for the first time or are struggling in your recovery, take heart, because God is walking alongside you and will not give up on you because He has a reason and a purpose for your life. Don't quit before the miracle happens, because in this family, no one fights alone. I now sleep at night without fear of death, for I know one day when I stand before God, I will hear my Lord say, well done, good and faithful servant. Thank you for letting me share.